Good evening, comrades. Thank you very much for joining us tonight. We've decided not to suspend our side of the class struggle. Instead, we've called an extra meeting to make sure we do actually have something to discuss, and we certainly do. Good evening, comrades. Thank you very much for joining us. This off. Apologies, that's the live stream on YouTube. So, comrades, I mean, I'm not the only one who finds it extremely difficult watching the news these days. It is everywhere, the death of the Queen. And I think there's a nice little saying by Percy Shelley: monarchy is the only string that ties the robber's bundle, which is quite a nice little quote and summarizes, of course, why the death of the Queen is everywhere and has to be shoved down our throat for the next 2 weeks. There's going to be official mourning for 10 days, and then there's going to be, after the funeral on September the 19th, there's going to be another 7 days of royal mourning. And if you want, you can also continue with your national mourning in that period. It is, I think there's quite different views on the left on this issue. I'm quite surprised by some of the comments that I've been getting about, being disrespectful for, saying now is the time to call for a republic. We've had unions calling off or postponing their strike, which we'll get into. The TUC has called off their conference, and perhaps most perversely, is the Diggers Festival has been called off by a Labour council, the Labour Council in Wigan. The Diggers, the true levellers, of course, were outspoken about the need to overcome and overthrow the monarchy and to have this festival cancelled, as a sign of respect to the monarchy, is quite perverse. We want to discuss a few aspects tonight, and we're very pleased to welcome 3 distinguished speakers who have got a lot to say on the issue. We're first going to start with Roger Silverman, who is going to address us for about 10 minutes, all 3 speakers for about 10 minutes, and then we're going to open up for comments and questions from the floor. So Roger will be discussing the question of decline of imperialism and decline of the monarchy, how they are actually quite related. Hi, Roger. Thank you.
Okay, comrades. Well, let's start by saying that there are many people who dismiss the monarchy as a pantomime sideshow, and I'm afraid that they're very much mistaken. The role of the monarch is crucial. Prime ministers are appointed and subject to dismissal by the monarch. Witness, for instance, the arbitrary dismissal of the mildly left reformist Prime Minister of Australia, Gough Whitlam, in 1973. The Prime Minister in Britain reports once a week to the monarch when they discuss in detail the policies to be followed by the government. The late Queen and her heir and successor have constantly monitored and often interfered with proposed legislation. Above all, the police and the armed forces swear allegiance not to the elected government of the day, but to the royal monarch, potentially guaranteeing legitimacy to any future coup. Let's remember the overt threats made by Her Majesty's armed forces to a future Corbyn government, when one general promised outright mutiny and paratroopers used a picture of Corbyn as target practice. And in both cases, they had not even the most perfunctory rebuke. Even, of course, the loyalty of the royal family to British imperialism was at times in doubt. At the time of the First World War, George V was the first cousin both of the Russian Tsar Nikolai Romanov and also of Germany's Kaiser Wilhelm. And the family felt obliged to change their name from the Gotha Saxe-Coburgs to the Windsors. In the run-up to the Second World War, Edward VIII's flirtation with Hitler is very well documented, and even his suspected active treachery at the outset of the war, when he was sent to France to monitor their strategic defenses, and he exposed secrets, or at least was accused of exposing their secrets to the Nazis, following which he was summarily and discreetly dispatched to the Bahamas. But the whole royal family at that time was similarly tainted with Nazi sympathies. Rudolf Hess, for instance, parachuted to Britain for secret negotiations with British aristocrats, and Prince Michael another brother of the king, crashed en route to a suspected meeting with Nazi emissaries in Sweden. And in fact, even the initial sympathies in the pre-war period, of course not since, of George VI have been subject to scrutiny. The royal family presided over all the crimes of British imperialism. At the time of the death of George VI, the late Queen was personally visiting Britain's colony, Kenya, at the very time when Kenya's colonial administrators were committing the most unspeakable, brutal atrocities on the Kikuyu people. And since then, of course, what was left of the empire has completely gone. The monarchy has long become, in that sense, an anomaly and the relic of a long collapsed empire. That being so, it's hardly likely to survive, never mind the collapse of the empire in the past, but the coming disintegration of Britain itself. For where once Britain ruled an empire on which the sun never sets, following the collapse of the British Empire has become the beginning of the disintegration of the United Kingdom itself. It's just one referendum away from losing Scotland. And the current convulsions regarding its status following Brexit mean that before long, Northern Ireland could easily conclude some kind of accommodation, if not even a straight reunification deal with the Irish Republic. Because despite the prejudices of the Unionists, a majority of both communities there opposed Brexit. So Great Britain could soon no longer exist, let alone constitute a united kingdom. Instead, just England and possibly, even that's in doubt, Wales, could sink to the status of just a part of an offshore island off the European mainland, a tourist spot for sightseers visiting such ancient monuments as the Tower of London and Shakespeare's birthplace, perhaps also taking in the whiskey stills of neighbouring Scotland in a double bill. So how then has this obsolete relic survived, apparently unscathed, for so long? And here I have to say something which may surprise comrades. I think that deference to the late Queen Elizabeth has been maintained largely due to her personal discretion, prudence, and restraint in exercising her powers over the last 7 decades. After all, just imagine how easily that fragile tissue could have been shattered if instead of her playing that role over that period had been performed instead by someone lacking that sense of diplomacy. Let's say by her husband, or by her mother, or by her uncle, or shall we say her second son. I think to that extent, the accolades bestowed on her memory are not entirely misplaced. But the mystique of royalty is obviously an anomaly and an anachronism. Let's not forget that Queen Elizabeth was not always so revered or so immune from public hostility. Remember, for instance, Britain's most influential media mogul, Rupert Murdoch. Remember when he boasted that the Tories won the 1992 general election because it was the Sun what won it, and who also, in effect, won the 1997 election for Tony Blair. For several years, Rupert Murdoch shamelessly deployed his immense propaganda power to utterly lambast and ridicule the monarchy and the Queen personally, sometimes using cheap, smutty schoolboy sneers. For instance, when she had described the year in which 3 of her children's marriages had broken up and her favourite castle had burned down as her annus horribilis. Moreover, and more to the point, let's not forget how public reverence for the Queen similarly evaporated following the death of Diana, when by her initial display of cold aloofness, she exposed the institution and herself personally to accusations of indifference. And of course, it went much further than that. There was even at the time widespread suspicion that Diana's death had been engineered by a royally contrived MI5 murder conspiracy. So the death of Elizabeth Windsor, a monarch who had reigned for 70 years, does mark a significant turning point in British history. It has to be understood in the context of the chronic decline and death agony of British capitalism. Where once it was the workshop of the world, today it's losing its last remnants of productive industry, most of them by now just assembly plants owned by Japanese, Indian, and other foreign companies, which had only nested here because it was a springboard into the EU, and which, as a result of Brexit, are now on the point of leaving. Along with Britain's decay, a new faction has displaced the old establishment. Over the centuries since the end of the Civil War, behind a permanent royal facade, political power has shifted from the aristocracy to industry to finance. The remnants of the old patrician establishments have been ruthlessly squashed. Where Thatcher destroyed the captains of industry and Johnson undermined the power of the City of London, the party which ruled England for 350 years has fallen into the clutches of a bunch of property speculators and hedge fund managers. So the recent scandals of the British monarchy are not irrelevant sideshows or a trivial diversionary soap opera. The disgrace of Prince Andrew, the continuing distaste for Charles and especially Camilla, and of course the abdication of Harry, they're all sure precursors to the demise of the dynasty itself. And where the late sovereign was still held in some reverence, now that her reign has come to an end, the surviving members of the dynasty will hold no such charisma or appeal. One last point. There's a carefully maintained myth that unlike the uncouth French or the Russians, the British are constitutionally averse to revolution. But just remind me, who were the first to chop off the head of a king 150 years before the French? Thanks, comrades.
Thank you very much, Roger. I think it was the British, the English. I knew that one. Yeah, we're going to talk about that in a little while. Thank you very much, Roger. I think it's also the decline of empire is very, very visible these days, with a number of countries planning referendums to get rid of the Queen as a head of state. This will trouble them greatly, and which is why they sent, people on various Caribbean tours, etc. But they keep backfiring, and strangely, people that were enslaved by the British Empire don't want to celebrate the Queen that much longer. So thank you very much, Roger. Mike McNair is now going to have a look at the crown prerogative of, the power to go to war, for example, of the Queen, and the executive power and reality of power in the Constitution. And I'm going to share quickly something from which Loki has posted, which is, one aspect of what we're going to talk about here is, the royalty is being presented as, it's the national, it's above everything. It doesn't get involved in politics, nothing to do with it. It's just a figurehead, etc. When in fact, they've been involved in changing laws to make sure royals don't have to pay that many taxes, don't have to adhere to the equality laws, etc. So there's all sorts of exceptions, and that's just one of the various aspects. So very pleased to have Mike with us, who is a tutor in law, expert in constitutional law, and thank you for joining us.
Thanks. I think I'd say that I'm an expert in constitutional law. I do know more about the history. I begin, though, with a very general point, which is of considerable importance. The British Constitution consists of a combination of laws and customs, and the customs are also called conventions. If we strip out the conventions, the laws are actually much more royalist, monarchical in character than they appear. And Tina has already referred to the point. Acts of Parliament, statutes passed by Parliament, are the ultimate source of law in English law. They have to be passed by the Queen or King, will now be the King, the Lords and Commons. And the King, it's going to have to be, it changes because the formula which is used for the Crown to signify assent to an Act of Parliament, so the Act of Parliament is passed, is le roi le veult. The king wants it. It hasn't been used since 1708. The formal formula for denying assent, and so the last time it was a queen, La Royne, Queen Anne, La Royne s'avisera. The queen will think about it, was the formula for denying royal assent. In reality, although the royal assent has not been formally and explicitly denied since 1708, as Tina just said and posted, what replaced it is a process of informal consultation by government, so that bills are killed before they get to the point of being passed against the will of the crown. And the famous one of that is the Catholic Emancipation, which George IV refused to accept that it could be passed. And although it was never presented to him, the knowledge among his ministers that he would veto any legislation for Catholic emancipation led them to not pass it. And yes, a lot of that happens. Back to the last point, Roger's last point, the British were the first to cut the king's head off in 1649. And at the same time, the Parliament, the House of Commons passed resolution on the 6th of February 1649 that the House of Lords was useless and dangerous and ought to be abolished. And on the 7th of February, that the office of a king in this nation and to have the power thereof in any single person is unnecessary, burdensome, and dangerous to the liberty, safety, and public interests of the people of this nation, and therefore ought to be abolished. And the single person here is important. The architects of the Commonwealth understood that republicanism is about the subordination of the executive to groups of people rather than to one single person. After Oliver Cromwell made his coup d'etat, the instrument of government which was created explicitly restored the role of a single person in the form of the Lord Protector. And it was the single person with the Lord Protector which continued from 1653, single person together with the Parliament, with the Lord Protector substituting for the King, which continued until 1659, when Richard Cromwell was overthrown and there was a brief life of the Republic, which was then collapsed by General Monk invading with the Scottish Occupation Army, moving the Scottish Occupation Army down to England, and the restoration of the monarchy. Why is this history important to us? It's important to us because the role of the single person and of the monarchy is absolutely not unique. We happen to have these archaic remnants of Norman French, Le Roy Le Veult, and we happen to have a pretense of celebration of the antiquity of the monarchy, though the government unceremoniously disposed of Edward VIII in the 1930s, precisely because of the reasons of his closeness to the Hitler regime, though they used the cover of his wish to marry a divorcee as the excuse for doing it. And in reality, the government had the British ruling class had unceremoniously disposed of monarchs before, and James VII is the obvious case where the rulers invited the Dutch to invade the country in order to get rid of him. So the single person, however, the monarch, is a constitutional principle, which is reflected in the fact, again, as Roger said, that the prime minister is technically appointed by the monarch. And in Australia, that has been used in the recent past to dispose of a government in order to get rid of it at a time which was convenient for the success of the opposition party, a purely party political act by the Governor General. In Grenada, it was the authority of the Queen gave backing to the American invasion, though the American invasion was decided on, as far as anybody can tell, without consultation with the British government, but the executive power backs it up. It's as Roger said, the armed forces, the police, the judiciary is equally important. Swear allegiance. Members of Parliament are required to swear allegiance to the monarch, and it was notoriously the case that the Irish Republicans refused to swear allegiance in order to take their seats in Parliament. We can add that the Queen can, or the King will be able to, and has absolutely routinely passed legislation by order in council by the Privy Council. The effect of that legislation is by prerogative. It's, albeit that it's usually done under statutory powers, but there's nothing to stop them legislating by order in council under prerogative. The legal position is simply that an order in council is binding insofar as it doesn't contradict existing statute. So nothing to stop you having a broad general statute and then an order in council which does a whole lot of detail and changes of one sort and another. We've recently had the prerogative of prorogation exercised by Boris Johnson and the judges, rather surprisingly, in my view, ruling that the advice given to the Queen to prorogue Parliament was unlawful advice in the context of Brexit. The price, it must be said, for the manoeuvres which were done against Brexit by the legal manoeuvres which were done by the Remain camp was to make it politically impossible for Brexit to be defeated politically, because they presented the Remain camp as the opponents of political democracy. But again, the operation of prerogative, the appointment of peers is in the gift of the Queen, which makes the House of Lords, in essence, the nominees of the executive. The power of making war is in the Queen, but it's in the King, but it's in the executive in the end. And most of these prerogative powers are basically exercised. They're in the crown, but they're in the crown and exercised by government, or particularly by the Prime Minister. And the consequence of all this stuff is that the single person is the symbol in the state of the authority of the manager. The monarch was the symbol in the state of the authority of the landlord, but it's still, while the city boys in the 1649, 1650 and the gentry were keen to get rid of the single person and so on, the single person is there as the authority of the manager, in addition to which the English monarchy is fantastically wealthy. The reason why the English monarchy is fantastically wealthy is to keep solidarity between the monarchy and the landlord class. I think it's a mistake to imagine that the landlord class has become unimportant. The petty landlords are just as important in the base and financing of the Tory party as large landlords, the cadre of the base of the Tory party, and as the large landlord class, the synthesis between the landlord class and the financial capitalist class, what was referred to by Kane and Hunt, writing in the 1990s, as gentlemanly capitalism. The culture has changed. We can no longer call the governments of Boris Johnson and so on as gentlemanly the English establishment gentlemanly capitalists, but nonetheless the social basis, the connection between the landlord class and the image of the monarchy and the cult of nostalgia. Yes, we become Venice. We transitioned like Venice and Genoa from being a great productive hub and trading entrepot to being finance capitalist sector, and we gradually transitioned into being merely a tourist attraction. Genoa never became a tourist attraction, but Venice spent at least a century as principally a tourist attraction. So these things, the single person I flag simply because this is the constitutional order which has become typical. It's not merely British. There are at least half a dozen monarchies in Europe. Some very recently created, the Spanish monarchy created after the fall of Franco. And most of the states which don't have monarchy have either executive presidency or a very powerful executive prime minister. The single person, the Cromwellian model of the constitution, is alive and well and reflects the class basis of the social order. That's it.
Thank you very much, Comrade. I think you explained very well how monarchy and the crown, crucially, I think people on the left tend to ignore that the crown as is very part and parcel center of how modern capitalism is run, and is quite closely linked to it, how it developed since 1649. We're now going to take a look at another really important aspect with Kevin Bean, which is the role of ideology, before we discuss how we can actually overthrow it, or talk about how to overthrow and how to get rid of the monarchy. And again, I want to share a couple of things on screen. Least surprising is perhaps this from the Labour Party. That's the official opposition. But there's also we have the TUC calling off, as you know, their conference. We've got Mick Lynch. Last week he was the hero of the working class, and now he says the RMT joins the whole nation in paying its respect to Queen Elizabeth. The whole nation, we're all in it together in mourning, and loving the monarchy. Sam Tarry has suspended his campaign to stop the right wing getting rid of him. I doubt the right wing will do the same favor back at him. Richard Bergin, Sarah Sultana, John McDonnell, all of them wishing deepest sympathy, not one of them mentioning the idea that monarchy is perhaps not natural and not something that we should just accept. And they're all, I think the role of ideology, even on the left, has been very, how it reflects even on the left is very, very crucial to sustaining not just the monarchy, but the monarchy as part and parcel of the system of capitalism, that if we accept being, ruled by people born to rule over us, then we'll accept anything. So I'm pleased to have Kevin Bean here to discuss that a little bit further before we then open up for questions and comments from the floor. If you want to ask a question, make a comment, please click raise hand. Thank you.
Thanks, Tina. Thanks, comrades. I'd like to pick up on some of the themes that both Roger and Mike have outlined, but I'd like to begin really with the BBC's coverage of the death of Queen Elizabeth II and today's proclamation of King Charles III. I did have to steel myself to watch quite a lot of it. The way that I did it was to dip into it for 10-minute segments, and then, rather like plunging into the water, coming up for a bit of air. But it is very useful, and I would recommend that comrades listen and watch a certain amount of it. As I say, steel yourselves, but do so in a critical way. Because let's look at the presentation of the monarchy that we see in the various coverage. Look at the newspapers, look at the news broadcasts. And I think what we see there is something that is deeply ideological. And for socialists and for Marxists, the role of ideology is to portray that which is clearly unnatural, which is not uncontested, as both natural and uncontested. And as Tina says, the idea of the monarchy as being, in a sense, the unifying element, the thing that holds us together, something that everybody accepts, in the way that those various tweets and statements from the Labour Party and trade union leaders, this is something that the whole nation joins in. Well, I can assure comrades that I've been living a fairly normal life for the last couple of days. For example, yesterday I took part in a protest here in Liverpool about local government cuts. And this afternoon I was out and about doing all the things that people do. And what I noticed was that everybody else was doing the same thing. I didn't notice a lot of tears. I didn't notice mournfulness. I noticed people getting on about their lives. Now, it may well be that, I'm in an outlandish place full of leftists and revolutionaries and radicals, but I suspect that like the people today who demonstrated against the shooting dead of a young man in London, that I am, in many ways, I represent another type of majority, another group of people who challenge this narrative, who challenge this argument that the monarchy represents all of us. Now, I want to talk about, I suppose, two elements in this story. One is the focus on the individual person of the monarch, and in particular the late Queen, who in many ways represents both an element of continuity and the references to history, the references to the monarchy going back into a dim and distant medieval past, but also represents something of a modernization of the monarchy. I'm old enough to remember when the monarchy began in the 1960s to slightly modernize itself, when, for example, various films and media coverage began to show the royal family as a family like us, and the deliberate portrayal of the royals as people like us. And I think it's the sort of the contradictory elements, the elements of mystification, the constitutional role that Mike and Roger have outlined, but also the idea of continuity and of tradition, that this is an institution that goes back into the dim and distant past. We all know enough fairy stories. We know enough popular culture about kings in the Middle Ages. It's sort of inbuilt into our popular culture. So we have that sort of sense that this is the embodiment of something that's been unchanging. And as both Mike and Roger have outlined, that clearly isn't the case. Not only was there a revolution in England, not only was England the first country where the king was put on trial as a traitor against the Commonwealth, but it was done so in some senses as a democratic idea in that way. And also the struggles of the working class and of radicals and Democrats in the 18th and the 19th and the 20th centuries against monarchical power, that's all put to one side, because the emphasis is on continuity. The emphasis is on the way that the monarchy embodies that continuity and embodies those traditions. Now, historians and others often make use of a very important phrase, which is the invention of tradition. And if you look very closely at the history of the monarchy, you see that far from it being unchanging, it's actually adapted and changed, not just in the sense that the monarchy that was restored in 1660 was a very different monarchy, not just in the sense that in 1688, when it looked as if there would be a resurgence of absolutism, that monarchy was overthrown. But it's also in the way that the monarchy has adapted and changed to meet the interests of capitalism and the bourgeois state. There's a feeling on the left, for example, that this is, quote, a feudal relic. Now, in some senses, it is a feudal relic. It obviously, the idea of an hereditary monarch, anything being hereditary, as Thomas Paine said, you know, an hereditary shoemaker is a ridiculous idea. Hereditary brain surgeon is an even more ridiculous idea, but an hereditary ruler is an absolutely preposterous idea. Just because someone is born to somebody else doesn't make them a fit representative. But that portrayal of continuity and tradition, I think, isn't accidental. And in a country like Britain, where the idea of a stable constitutional order is so important for capitalism, it really is a key theme. In the 19th century, with the growth of agitation for democracy, with the growth of a working class movement, the ruling class used the monarchy as a particular instrument of mystification. I think we can see, as Mike alluded to, the intersection of imperialism, of landed power, of finance capitalism, and particularly the development of the Conservative Party from the 1870s onwards as a mass force that upholds imperialism and upholds capitalism. And there's quite a conscious idea. Benjamin Disraeli, the leading conservative figure in this period, boosts the monarchy, creates the idea of the monarch as the sort of mother of the nation, and links that very closely to empire. And this, I think, is this sort of conscious shaping, this invention of tradition, this idea that we have an historically formed monarchy and that this is what binds us together, I think is really very central. So as an ideology, monarchism isn't just a sort of nod to the past. It's very much part of the present, and in the ways that Roger and Mike outlined. Particularly, I think the idea of rule and the nature of rule being embodied in one person or in the hands of a small group of people, quite consciously anti-democratic. So, for example, when there's a debate on the left, or indeed in, let us just say, wider wider democratic circles, one of the arguments that's often put forward is, well, if we get rid of the monarchy, what do we have in its place? Do we have an elected president? And then, of course, references are made to Macron or to Trump or some other objectionable figure. What I think isn't put forward is the implication that we must have a figurehead, that we are, in a sense, children who need to be led and to be guided. We need someone to look up to. We need that sort of mystification. And a monarchy and the ideas of monarchy, and above all the ideas of tradition, imprison any sort of democratic idea. They imprison any sort of political subjectivity. So my argument for a republic is not just simply to do away with monarchy, but to do away with the politics, the idea that the mass of the population are not capable of self-government themselves, that we're not capable as human beings of deciding our own future. And monarchy embodies that. It's the whole idea that at the top of society, we have natural rulers, hereditary rulers, we have an established order. And we, of course, can't come along and uproot that. Except, of course, historically, we do all the time. They did it in the English Revolution, they did it in the American Revolution, they did it in the French Revolution, they did it in the German Revolution, they did it in the Russian Revolution. How many more revolutions do you want me to go through? You know, monarchy is a very contested concept, but it is, of course, at the heart of capitalism. And what it does is both through mystification and I think deliberate attempts to undermine ideas of democracy. There's one last area where, just referring back to the way that the British monarchy has changed in my lifetime, and that of course is an additional element, which is not just mystification, but the familiarity of the soap opera. So we have the paradox that we know a lot more about the monarchy as individuals or as sort of social constructions. We think we know about them in the same way that we think we might know something about film stars and actors and musicians and so on and so forth. And that also has a mystification role. It has a similar sort of role of persuading us that these people are not just distant. They are distant, they're above us, they're on a pinnacle, but they're also like us. And in that way, they are sort of characters in a soap opera that we can both identify with, but also look up to. You know, they are like gods who are familiar. They're like divinities made real, made human. So in that way, that the monarchy has been updated for the modern media age. It's not the same monarchy as it was even in the Second World War. It's not even the same monarchy that it was in the 50s. And that, of course, makes it all the more dangerous, but it makes it all the more important that our basic principles of democracy and of working class rule, of saying that the working class is able to run society, that we don't need the tutelage of elites, we don't need the tutelage of hereditary figures, and above all, we don't need any flummery. We don't need all the nonsense that we've seen today. What we need is working class power and democracy. And that's why the fight for the Republic is so important.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I think that's really spot on. They're like gods that we know, and King Charles now, he is changing the monarchy again, isn't he? He wants to do it slimmer, the slimline monarchy. And, you know, like Prince William, he's moved to a house where there isn't even space for valets and house cleaners. Can you imagine? They have to live in a separate house. That's how normal these people are going to live. Because I think they are actually, the fact that they're pouring all this money and this effort into this, the funeral and all of that is going to cost tens of millions. It's not a sign of strength. It's a sign of weakness. I believe that the idea of, you know, somebody's born to rule over us is contested, and it's been contested in Australia, it's been contested in a lot of other countries, and it will be contested in Britain, and it's being contested now. So I wanted to ask our three speakers really, how do we get rid of the how do we get rid of the monarchy? And Kevin has touched on it already, which is why I'm going to ask Roger and Mike. Because there's a lot of people will say, and quite rightly too, so, you know, look at the US, look at Israel, look at Germany. None of them have a monarchy. Are they any better than Britain? You know, what will we achieve if we just simply get rid of the monarchy? And that sort of is, of course, the idea of republic, that campaign, you know, that liberal bourgeois campaign republic who wants to replace the queen, the king, with an elected head of state. But that's not the socialist idea, is it, to get rid of the monarchy? Mike, can I ask you to reply to that first? How do we get rid? You know, do we do it like we got rid of Charles I, who then, you know, and then the monarchy was reestablished? There's a sort of, you know, irony there as well.
Yes, the return of the monarchy, the return of person at the return of under Cromwell and the return of the monarchy expressed the class interest of the gentry, but it's the gentry. We need to understand that the gentry are not a feudal aristocracy of the 1650s. They're guys who employ labor in large assembled groups of workers under authority. The finance capitalist superstructure of that. And so it's the class interests of the capitalist class as a class that there should be a single person in authority that not just partly because it's a backstop against the possibility of radical democracy, partly because its ideological effects and so on and so forth. So, okay, what we have to do is we have to win a political majority for the idea of radical democracy as opposed to capitalism. Not just as opposed to the monarchy, not just as opposed to the crown as the crown is technically a corporation. Sort of what? Yeah, the crown is a corporation, is a peculiar kind of corporation soul, like a bishop or the vicar of an Anglican church. That the king, the queen dies, but the king goes on. Not just to get rid of the individuals, not just to get rid of the monarchy, but also to get rid of the principle of the single person, to get rid of the principle of one-man management, to get rid of the principle of now, if we can win political majority for that sort of politics, and I don't mean a parliamentary majority, but a political majority for that sort of politics, then the question of getting rid of the monarchy becomes relatively straightforward, because it's a question that political majority will be reflected in the ranks of the armed forces as well as in the general public, and the possibility of dividing up as things stand. Yes, you referred to the Roger referred to the general's threats to Corbyn. If we got a political majority for radical democracy, then the general's threats to Corbyn would be met with threats from the ranks to the generals, not the Corbyn. Corbyn, of course, actually, it's still monarchism, because it's the man on horseback, the nice guy, the guy who's going to save us rather than us saving ourselves. That's it.
Thank you. How about you, Roger? How do you think we can get rid of the monarchy?
Right. This is where I know that some comrades will disagree with me, because no question about it, the monarchy is a cancer, it's an excrescence, it's a horrible infection, if you like, of society, and it's something that has no place in the modern world. But it is just one aspect of the disease of capitalism. It's as Mike and Kevin explained, the monarchy has adapted according to the time. It is not just a feudal relic. In one sense, it's a feudal relic, but it's the instrument, the chosen instrument of the ruling class of Great Britain, which is not the aristocracy, it's not the House of Lords, and it's not the royal family, it's the capitalist class. And I would say that the idea that we can get rid of the monarchy without also challenging the class system and the survival of capitalism itself is completely pie in the sky. It's impossible. We have many. Murdoch would have been in favour of a republic. Rupert Murdoch, at least while he was on that thing. Are we going to consider him to be an ally in our fight? There's nothing particularly anti-capitalist about wanting to change the political format and the political face of the state. There are plenty of republics in the world. I don't think that there's anything to choose in terms of democratic rights for the working class between the United Kingdom or the United States of America or France or Germany or any other of the capitalist republics that exist now. It's no panacea to say we want to get rid of the republic. If we limit ourselves to that, then we end up just chasing our own tails and getting nowhere. We have to say that the the fight for genuine democracy is inseparable from the fight for socialism and for the working class to take power.
Sorry, you could of course argue that, if you succeed in getting rid of the monarchy, it would, empower the people to question other things as well. But it does, I do quite agree, it needs to go hand in hand with the fight for socialism, not by itself, is of course, what Republic and these campaigns do. Kevin, then a question to you before we open up. I've been told quite a few times in the last few days that now is not the time to raise issues of the Republic and getting rid of the monarchy. It's disrespectful, apparently. And crucially, the working class isn't quite there yet. They're not ready to, take this step, etc. The workers can't go on strike. They don't feel like, they don't want to be respectful to the monarchy, etc. Should we criticize unions for abandoning their strike action or postponing it? Well, we'll see if it's been postponed or cancelled. Or is this actually the time when you speak up the loudest in these kind of situations? What do you think?
Yes, I think that this is absolutely the best time to raise these questions, because it's actually, for nothing else, it's the only thing that's on the news and in the media. If you can't raise the nature of the state, if you can't raise the fact that the head of state is changing without any sort of democratic accountability, then when can you raise it? And I suppose the answer is you can't raise it, because these things are taken as natural. They're things that you don't question. So this is absolutely the time. But perhaps more importantly, we should have been raising these questions. The workers' movement should have been raising these questions, as was the case in the 19th century in Britain, and indeed in the early 20th century. We should have been raising them long before, so that it doesn't just become an issue when there's a change of monarch, that it's actually quite central. And it's central for the reasons that both Mike and Roger alluded to in terms of constitutional power, and above all, the executive power in the hands of the Prime Minister, because that, as Mike has said about one-man management and about the concentrations of power, socialists are in favour of extreme democracy. We're in favour of the working class self-emancipation, and that means the replacement of the ideas of the concentration of power and the ideas of democracy. So we should be raising it, and we should be raising it constantly, not just as something that occurs in this period. In terms of the strikes, I think it's absolutely disastrous. Leaving aside the obsequious messages, it's not quite like voting for war credits in 1914. But when I heard that the strikes had been called off, I actually
next week's strikes, not just the one of the postal workers, but next week's strike.
I actually couldn't believe it and needed to look at it again. They were called off very quickly. I think within a matter of 20 minutes to half an hour. Although interestingly, and comrades can confirm this, the PCS, we have some local strikes in Liverpool. Maybe they're extended, but the PCS did go out on strike on Friday in that way. But
barristers continued as well.
Yeah, well, exactly. Yes, solidarity with the barristers in the vanguard of the working class in that way. But I think the important point is that, and the analogy which I made rather flippantly to the the civil peace that was in Germany in the First World War, seems to suggest that the class struggle can somehow be suspended. Seems to suggest that this is such a momentous event that's normal politics. As a comrade said to me yesterday, just because the monarch is dead doesn't mean to say that the capitalists are not exploiting us. I didn't notice that the stock exchange closed. I didn't notice that profits had stopped being accrued. That normal capitalist services, is continued. But perhaps more importantly, why I really think that this is an absolutely ridiculous move is it gives credibility to the idea that this institution somehow is above politics, that somehow we must all be involved in it. And it's a class institution, and it, is part of the system that we're struggling against. Yeah. So I'm very angry, and I don't know what the feeling was in other parts of the country, but comrades in this city were really up in arms about it. And we were out protesting, and as I said, those people in London who were out protesting today about the killing by the police of a young man in Streatham Hill, they certainly didn't think that this is the time to have a civil peace. So.
No, quite agree. I presume none of our other two main speakers disagree with that. So I'm gonna open up now to bring in Marion, please. If you have a particular question or comment directed at anybody in particular, say so. You can make
just some comments, really. Sure. I think for a long time the left has not taken the issue of the crown and the monarchy seriously, especially the powers that the Prime Minister has using the royal prerogative. I can remember having a row with someone in Workers' Power over this quite a few years ago, because to me, you underestimate the power that they represent. And if, as revolutionaries, if we want to create a society and bring about a society where there is true democracy, where every human being is developed to their full potential and we live in a totally different society, you've got to undermine the power that these people have. And I don't think layers of the working class aren't so royalist as they once were. I mean, some of my family are upset that it's had too much on the media. They think they've overplayed it this time. In the past, some of them were more royalist than the royals kind of thing. So it's not necessarily that the whole of the working class is buying into it, but it poses questions for us. What are our ideas that we want to promote that develops the confidence of working people that they can not only take power, they can use power to change the world? Because a lot of working class people don't have as much confidence as they should have. And it's not surprising, really. So for me, it's a question of how do we develop more collective ideas, and how do we motivate people for real change? And if you're saying it doesn't matter that the mystique of the royal family still exists, like some of the Labour left seem to be saying, some that should know better, then we're never going to change things fundamentally. So for me, the question is, we need also to develop our own programme and bring out some of the history of the levellers, of the diggers, of that kind of thing, so that people are aware we've got a proud tradition in this country where people did want revolutionary change. The society doesn't have to be like it is now. So for me, that's what we need to be developing more, getting that history out to people so they understand they can change things. And the real thing at the moment, it's not stopping Liz Truss putting extra money on the gas and electricity to say that we can pay 2,500 or whatever on gas and electricity. It's not stopping them attacking working people up and down this country. So the class war is still going on as far as they're concerned. And unfortunately, the misleaders of our class are running away from the battle again. And we need to try and change that as well. So for me, the key thing is, we've got to have more of these kinds of discussions, but concretise it as well to how we change in our localities, in the regions, nationally and international, to bring about the kind of change we need. Yeah. But the fight for democracy, we've got to concretise and say what we mean by democracy. We don't mean what the bourgeoisie mean by democracy. And we have to spell out what we mean by democracy. That's the key.
Quite right. Thank you very much, Marion. It's also worthwhile, for example, to look at some more recent fighters for republicanism, including Tony Benn, who put forward various law proposals on the issue. I mean, it's, he knew that's not the way to actually reach a republic, but it was quite an interesting aspect, which of course he was seconded by Jeremy Corbyn, who, when he was Labour leader, pushed that aside. That's not for now, that's for some other time, perhaps. Roger, Mike, and Kevin, if either of you want to speak at some stage, just raise your hand. Before I bring in Tony, actually, I'm going to read out a question from the Q&A, and I think Roger wanted to answer this one. I think you've highlighted that. This is from Peter. Could the speakers talk about the role of historical compromise, as the Cromwellian revolution was too weak to continue its change without the support of the feudal aristocracy, and how this compromise has affected British ideology and the politics of the Labour Party? We touched briefly on that aspect of King Charles being executed and then the monarchy in a modernized form being reinstated. But it is an interesting part of our history, so it is worthwhile discussing briefly. Roger, did you want to speak on that?
Very, very briefly. I mean, I think probably Kevin and Mike may very well know more of the historical detail, but I think the point is that this myth that the British have always been respectable and constitutional, and they always compromise, comes from that particular compromise that was made in 1688. When what happened, and of course it's not at all unique to British history, is that the revolution went into retreat and was followed by counter-revolution. And in the end, a compromise was reached whereby the capitalist class maintains the genuine and real economic power and social power in society, but they reached an accommodation with the relics of the feudal aristocracy and brought in a monarch who would be compliant with that settlement. And that has created this myth of British compromise. But in fact, of course, that's only one incident or one period in the history of British society. And I think that what is happening today in British society is a proof that a new era is also beginning now. Because I think what is happening is we've got almost the beginning. And again, there may be comrades who dispute this. We're almost at the beginning of a pre-revolutionary period in British society. It's a period which the kind of attacks that are coming on living standards and the kind of turmoil and the disintegration of capitalist society is coming at a pace that has not been seen for a long time, not even in my lifetime, never mind other comrades here. Mm-hmm. And I think the point is that that's because of the catastrophic attack on living standards on the one side, and the complete catastrophe of the strategy of the ruling class. It has no strategy now. The ruling class, which used to plan for decades ahead or even centuries ahead, now literally from one moment to the next, it's improvising new tactical ways to extricate themselves from the problem they've created. What we've got now is a strike wave which has been, which we haven't seen since the 1970s, encompassing the whole of society, encompassing not just the traditional elements, what's left of them, of the working class, but also on the one side, Amazon delivery workers, fast food workers, office cleaners, etc. And on the other side, and of course, Uber drivers. And on the other side, university lecturers, junior hospital doctors, and even criminal barristers who just launched the first open-ended indefinite strike which we've seen. So in that situation, I think some of the other buried traditions of British society are coming back to the fore.
Oliver Cromwell is, of course, a very strange, ambiguous figure. I think John Rees has called him in a recent LLA education series. So he signed the death warrant for Charles I, and then, of course, went on to kill those who actually pushed him into doing so, either level as he turned on them, not just the slaughter of the Irish, but also the slaughter of the revolutionaries who pushed him into making revolution. Kevin or Mike, do you have anything else to say on that issue?
I'll have a go quickly. I don't think the idea of historic compromise is actually terribly helpful in understanding the English Revolution. Mike Wood's arguments in her book, The Pristine Culture of Capitalism, are actually more helpful than the idea of historic compromise. The idea of historic compromise, it had this idea that somehow there was something unusually backward about the British Constitution, which resulted from there having been a historic compromise. But in reality, it turns out to be the case that every bourgeois revolution without exception, the bourgeoisie is a small minority class. Because the bourgeoisie is a small minority class, it has to ride to power on the back of larger classes, but as soon as it's ridden to power on the back of larger classes, it has to set up institutional structures which allow this small minority class to rule over the larger classes. And these institutional structures take the form of things which appear to be, in the British case, but also actually in a number of other countries, appear to be compromised with the old historic classes. But if, on the other hand, I spend an awful lot of my time reading the litigation of the English landed aristocracy of the 17th and 18th century, and the reality is they're concerned, the English landed aristocracy in the 17th and 18th century, they're not concerned with family honour. They're concerned with pounds, shillings and pence, and the calculation of the rate of return, and the calculation of how many years purchase a piece of land, and the running of the aristocrat Lord Wharton is a coal magnate. The Earl of Shaftesbury, in running an opposition, which is part of what flows into 1688, announces that he has 10,000 brisk boys from Wapping, which is the dockers and the sailors who he can mobilize to turn out. These guys are big capitalists. It's not a question of a compromise with an aristocracy which exploits in the ways that aristocracies traditionally exploit through serfdom and traditional customs and so on and so forth. So this is the point is not, my point is that this, which is actually consistent with what other comrades have been saying, this constitutional order has this idea, traditionalism. Kevin referred to the invention of tradition. An awful lot of this was invented by the spin doctors working for George III, because for George I and George II, and indeed William III, and Mary and Anne, all this father of the nation monarchism and glitzy ceremonial, and H.M. the Queen dies at Balmoral, and this is part of their Scottishness of God help us, that their immediate ancestors have presided over the practical conquest of Scotland in the aftermath of the 45 and the Highland clearances. This is recently constructed tradition, so that the historic compromise approach to it is actually positively unhelpful, because it carries the implication that somehow we could get a modernized, European organized capitalism, which would be modernized and liberal and not British, whereas actually what we'd get as like as not from Europeanizing is Italy and the ascendance, the coming ascendancy of the fascist party in government, or Marine Le Pen in France, etc., etc., etc. Yes, what we have to counterpose to this monarchy is self-government from top to bottom. radical democracy and radical democracy at work as well as as well as in politics. That's it.
Thank you. Kevin, did you want to say something briefly?
Yeah, this idea of a particular sort of genius of compromise in Britain does, I think, go back to the idea that there was a sort of compromise that ends the revolutionary period in 1660. And I think for the reasons that Mike says, it's it's clearly false, particularly because we have the sort of forms of monarchy, and we have the appearance of a particular type of aristocracy, particularly one that likes to portray itself as going back to the Norman conquest, when large amounts of that aristocracy and indeed that monarchy are very much a bourgeois monarchy and a bourgeois aristocracy. So I think that I think that this isn't just a sort of an historical debate. Comrades will remember the sort of Nair and Anderson thesis about the nature of the bourgeois revolution in England. I think it's very important politically, because when this idea is sort of modernized, or when it's brought to the fore, particularly in the 19th century, it's used as an idea that there hasn't really been much of a fundamental revolution in Britain. Or indeed, if we extend it, when we talk about the growth of democracy, that this is seen as some sort of natural development. I remember when Michael Gove was talking about the education curriculum, the history curriculum in the 2010s, and he talked about the idea of a sort of almost a march of democracy, about the way democracy evolves in Britain, and he talked about this particular genius for compromise. And I think that the monarchy becomes sort of part of that, so that the monarchy and the monarchical power evolves and changes, so that the Queen, in this latest incarnation, is, the sort of end product almost of a compromise which has reduced the monarchical power, and that this has been really part of a gradual historical development. So I think it's much more than just talking about the nature of the bourgeois revolution, and talks about the way that the labor movement or any radical challenges to bourgeois society are incorporated into British society. And of course, the way that you give people the vote, indeed the idea of giving people the vote, giving women the vote, giving the working class a vote, all of this idea of the sort of to and fro of politics and of our particular genius for compromise, I think is something we have to fracture. And one of the ways that we do it isn't only by a reference to history and knowing about that history in the way that the other comrades have mentioned, but also in our own politics now, which is why the idea of the sort of class peace as a result of the death of the monarch is absolutely disastrous. This is when we should be pressing home the fight for democracy, the fight for workers' demands. And it again sort of links to this idea that there's something sort of above politics. There isn't. There's nothing above, the fight for these demands.
Okay, we've had, after a slow start, we've got quite a few people with their hand up now, and I'm trying to get them all in, but we have to finish at about 8. So you three comrades, unless you have you want something pressing to say to a particular speaker, which is absolutely doable, please put up your hand. Otherwise, I'll bring you back at the end, if that's okay. So Tony, please.
Yes, it's been a fascinating discussion, and no doubt it will continue. My own view is that the monarchy is probably at its weakest point now since the death of Diana. And that, in part, I think, accounts for the absolutely absurd wall-to-wall coverage we're seeing on the BBC, ITV, and even Al Jazeera. When I turned over, what did I get but coverage of the royals? An example, Liverpool fans booing the Queen, God save the Queen. I was on the streets of Brighton today handing out don't pay leaflets. Not one comment about the Queen, about how could you do this, about discourtesy. It really is quite amazing that it hasn't affected ordinary people. And this is why the decision of the TUC and the unions to call off the strikes and to call off the Congress is so bankrupt. It really does show the limits of their petty reformism. And it's right. I mean, Tony Benn emphasized that republicanism isn't about the individual personality of the Queen. And it's quite right to pay respect, if you like, to the individual. Craig Murray does that in a very interesting blog, but to separate the person from the position. I mean, that's why when I composed my blog, No Tears, No Joy, I made it clear I wasn't saying ding dong, thank God the witch has gone, like we did for Thatcher. I mean, it's a completely different political phenomena, but there's no doubt in my mind, the struggle, the fight for republicanism is a fight for democracy and to get rid of the system as a whole. It's not a separate fight, because it is a separate fight. We will actually end up with something like the American or the French system. And I think that's quite important. And I think I don't know what's been happening with the BBC, but I know that when Prince Philip died, they got a record number of complaints, 110,000, which I think was 50 times more than it ever got before over a particular subject. And that shows the length of disillusionment, if you know what I mean. But the monarchy is also changing. Walter Bagehot talked about not letting the light in on the daylight in on the magic of the royal family. And we've seen since Diana, where they've become a soap opera in the sense that the royal family has become demystified in many ways. So you have this massive reaction against Prince Andrew, who's widely derided. I mean, he really can't show his face in public almost now. And I don't think Prince Charles, no, not Prince Charles, King Charles, I keep getting it. He's not going to attract the same support as an individual, however much the BBC and others will try. I mean, all the Saudi money that he was carrying around in paper bags, we haven't heard any of that, and I can't imagine why. So I think we are in different times, and the question is how we conduct the struggle. But I think we do have to make the point, and I was thinking of moving a resolution in my own Unite branch, condemning the decision of the TUC to cancel workers' strikes. Have they cancelled sacking people, exploiting people? Of course not. The capitalist operation goes on as a whole, but the workers must give up their struggle for the time being. It is totally and utterly bankrupt. Thank you.
Thank you, Tony. Carol, please.
Yes, I must just say the black is satirical before we start. Yeah, Tony, I absolutely agree. I absolutely agree with what Tony's just said. But mainly I wanted to come on and say, people are talking about the American Republic, the French Republic. That isn't the kind of republic that we're talking about. We're talking about a social democratic republic where power lies with the people, where local, citizens' assemblies, local and regional, have most of the power. We will need a central government to make laws, obviously, but the power must be with the people in local assemblies. And that would be a social democratic republic. And in order to, if we're going to get to that stage, we have to get rid of the monarchy. We have to get rid of the crown. There's no other way to do it. And through that kind of republic, people will begin to realize, yes, we can do this for ourselves. We don't need this monarch to tell us how to run our country and our local areas. We can do this ourselves. So I see it as a social democratic republic being a transition stage to full socialism. But I think it's a very necessary transition stage that we need to go through. Thank you.
Thank you, Carol. Alex, please.
Can you hear me?
Yep.
Ah, that's good. I'm broadly in agreement with everything I've heard so far. But it's quite clear to me, but it has been for some time, that our system of government is thoroughly broken and we need to change it in some way. Because we live in this digital age, I mean, many of us are online. I guess, I don't know what the percentage of the population that can't access the internet is. But certainly a digital identity would be no different to a national insurance number, and it could be secure, and we could all vote on everything and propose things and have them voted on. Just an idea. That's my 10 penneth.
Fair enough. Thank you, comrade. Paul, please.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi there. Yeah, on social media, on my social media circle, I'm both on Facebook and Twitter. I've been struck by the amount of people in my social media circle that are normally quite good at class politics, but suddenly we're being told to watch our tone and show a bit of respect. And I'm quite shocked by that. It's I get the respect for the individual and so on, but what I can't stand is the hypocrisy of it all. Some of these people were the very same people that were cheering when Thatcher died. I understand that, of course, and that if you know that government did a lot of evil things, and so I understand that. But of course, the late Queen was not, in fact, separate from that. And unfortunately, it seems a lot of my comrades have inadvertently swallowed the royalist propaganda about how the Queen was separate from the politics, and of course, that all serves a purpose, and I'm pretty sad to see fellow comrades falling into that crap. My biggest thing, as other comrades have said, is that I'm really quite disgusted that the trade union bureaucracy have called off the strikes, and that's what I'm really upset about in this particular case. But then, of course, the trade union bureaucracy, in a way, are all part of the ruling class, aren't they? They're much higher paid than rank file trade union members, and so on. So that might be an unpopular comment, but it's not unusual for trade union bureaucrats to take a very different view to the ordinary trade unionist on the ground. So I think that's an important class element that needs to be dealt with. And like Carol, I don't think just looking at America or some of the other places that are republics, I don't think that's a very good argument for not becoming a republic, as some comrades have said in the past. If you're a socialist and you essentially believe in democracy by default, being a republic is the prerequisite, really. And then everything else, it's got to extend from that. That's all I've got to say. Thanks.
Thank you, Paul. I think most of our speakers would agree with you on the criticism of the trade union bureaucracy. Diana, please.
Hi. I agree with and really appreciate most of the points everybody's been making. I particularly agree with Carol about where we want the power to be and the type of republic we want, and Paul's points about the trade unions. But I'm thinking about where our power actually lies, and that's with the monarchy, the crown, the capitalist establishment. But we're also very much controlled by the US and NATO. We are not allowed to have a government or any powerful representatives that they don't agree with. And that also the US has a track record of making sure that governments don't have representatives that they don't like. one of the reasons why Putin and the Russian Federation are so demonized is because the US hasn't managed to control them. That I wasn't actually intending to mention. So, wondering to what extent is the monarchy, the crown, helping to hide the fact that the US and NATO controls us, and how can we get a truly democratic socialist republic, getting rid of those bums so they're don't have power over it? I mean, one example we have of having power, a number of examples, but one is we've got the nuclear bases. We've got Trident in Scotland, and we're told that's our own nuclear capability. It's just not. It belongs to the US. Truss is itching to get her finger on the nuclear button, but it's the US that will decide. It's also the US that's pushing, the US and NATO that's pushing all the Western NATOs to flood Ukraine with arms. So I'm wondering, how do we deal with that? Can we deal with that problem? How can we deal with it? And how will getting rid of the monarchy help?
Thank you, comrade. Mark, please.
Yeah, good evening. Firstly, Marianne mentioned that it was important that people should remember our history. So I'm pleased to see that on August the 13th, we had about 150 people who came along in Halifax and saw the raising of a plaque to commemorate those who were killed in August 1842 in what was part of a general strike movement. 150 might not seem too many, but it's probably the largest gathering of an event organised by the left in Halifax in probably around 20 years. So that gives you some indication that in itself was a success. For those that are interested in it in particular, I'd recommend Catherine Howe's book, 1842, A Year of Crisis. The 1842 event was the largest mobilisation of the working class, which took place in the 19th century, or the industrial working class. Going on to the current subject, I think we do miss a few opportunities, however, to score some successes against the Royals. It shouldn't be forgotten that ultimately they are ahead of the aristocracy, an aristocracy which still controls the large amounts of land throughout this country. And the result of that is that just 188,000 people own 2/3 of the land, and 50% of house prices go on the need to buy up that land. So it does have a direct economic effect on working class people. It should not be forgotten also that right across the world, the largest landowners are monarchs. So it's not just the Queen or the King here, but it's throughout the world that they are the largest single landowners. The Queen, in essence, actually owns all of land in this country, because the rest of us are really leaseholders. We are tenants as such. And for that, I'd recommend a book by Kevin Cahill called Who Owns Britain? Where I would don't also forget that these large landowners are the beneficiaries of large amounts of money in the form of subsidies. It was through the Common Agricultural Policy. And whilst this government is moving to some extent to cut some of that large amount of money, because it's cutting per general the amount of money going to farming and food under the Sustainable Farming Initiative, it will still be the largest beneficiaries. Those with the most land will get the most and the largest payouts. My final point is, I do think that we will have to wait for a revolution, in essence, to get rid of the monarchy, unfortunately, in this country. One space where I do think that the left has to continuously campaign for the issue of republic has to be the demand that we remove the British troops from Ireland and that we support a republic, a united Ireland. So those are the points I'd like to make. Thanks for your time.
Thanks, Mark. Could you put those book titles into the chat?
Yeah, I'll do that. Yeah.
Thank you. Ed, please.
Thanks, Tina. Thanks very much, all the comrades who've spoken. I found this meeting very interesting. I think the ruling class are trying to milk this this situation for all they can in terms of trying to revive a spirit of national mourning and so on, because it is for them the perfect gift of distraction from the strike wave that was building up. The problem is they can't do that for long, because the strike wave is based on the desperation of working class people to raise their wages in line with inflation. And, it's only a temporary distraction that they won't be able to get away with this for long. I also agree with the points that comrades have made, that there are a lot of people who are not taking this as seriously as the media would like us to, who are talking about other things, and who are even a bit irritated by the amount of coverage that this is getting. In terms of how we get rid of the monarchy, I don't think there's any controversy in this meeting that they need to be got rid of. I mean, I think it's clear from what's been said in this meeting that the monarchy is such an integral part of the arrangement of checks and balances, as the ruling class call it in this country. Checks and balances means their way of stopping anything disastrous happening to their system. So you've got the media, who will generally try and give an impression that they're a bit neutral, but when somebody like Corbyn comes onto the horizon, they deliberately start to campaign against him. You've got all the shenanigans in Parliament that people, anyone through this system trying to get a majority has to negotiate with opposition parties and so on. You then behind that you've got the military. Behind the military you've got the monarchy as well to back them up. All of these are part of the system that keeps British capitalism in power. And if we are to challenge any of it, we come up against all of it. And so, I agree with the points that comrades have said, that to get rid of the monarchy, we have to be thinking it's not just a question of changing the constitution on a capitalist basis. We have to be thinking, I agree with comrades, of workplace democracy, of developing grassroots democracy, we have to work towards the kind of society where we are not only getting rid of monarchical rulers, but we are also getting rid of the economic system that they represent, the capitalist system that they represent. It's part and parcel of a much bigger movement. Parliament was invented before the telephone. It's entirely possible for workers' organisations in this day of modern technology to invent far more sensitive forms of democracy than Parliament. But it should be possible to replace your representative within a day, not wait 5 years for another election. And that was also one of the principles of the Paris Commune, by the way, in the middle of the 19th century, that, you don't have to wait until the next formal election. If you don't like who's representing you, you can get rid of them there and then. That's part of workers' democracy. And it's only through that kind of grassroots, bottom-up movement that we're going to change anything in this system, anything fundamentally in this system. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. I think it's also worthwhile looking at the Chartists in this, fighting for working class democracy. You had a lot to say on this issue. And most of their demands actually have been realized, apart from annual parliaments, which they saw as a way of being able to get rid of your representatives quickly. Matthew, please.
Hi, comrades. Yeah, thanks. It's a really good discussion, actually. I think there's a number of points. Interesting enough, this exposes all sorts of stuff. Of course, the new king has been has now sworn his to uphold a Protestant Scotland. For instance, which is just bizarre, and actually that's been disavowed by the Church of Scotland's put up a statement saying, well, it doesn't mean us. because he's not head of the Church of Scotland. And of course, actually the only thing he's actually head of in Scotland is the Episcopalian Church, which is a tiny operation, so it's really quite bizarre. And also, of course, I mean, all this stuff, they banned all football effectively, because obviously, I mean, apart from anything else, I think they were in terror of what football fans, when gathered together, would say, certainly a lot of them, about the nature of the monarchy. And not least the owners and managers of Celtic Football Club, I suspect, were deeply relieved when they're not playing any football at all this weekend. But I think what we're looking at really is fundamentally the fragility of the system. The system is not, it's actually getting to the point, you're seeing it's extreme crisis added to by this war. I mean, the core of it is this war that has been provoked in Ukraine by the US. And really you're looking at a situation where that's going through everything. And we're getting to the point now, I mean, it's actually being reported that people here in Scotland are committing suicide because they don't think they can pay their electricity bills and they don't see how they would survive. It's getting to that point. And you see, I mean, there's enormous anger and fear among the working class. There's no question, and this is the driver, of the strike action. At the same time, obviously, you're looking at, the interesting thing is to contrast that to the impact of Corbyn. Now, I mean, Corbyn's a reformist. Interestingly enough, of course, Corbyn. One of the key points I thought of Corbyn's thing was he going to join the Privy Council? I.e., would he participate in the structures, the secret structures of the state? Of course, he did. But the other thing, of course, is he didn't turn up for the installation of King Charles. Nobody's actually seen him at that, which is interesting to see whether did they not invite him or did he just not want to go? I mean, I presume they didn't invite him. But it shows that even a minimal set of reforms that Corbyn proposed, I mean, nothing Corbyn proposed was particularly radical of any sort, actually, was anathema to the ruling class. The ruling class simply could not tolerate the notion that the working class should be conceding anything, and you could see, actually, as comrades have said, the whole thing, the notion is one of US hegemony. The interesting thing about that, of course, was Mike Pompeo, as Secretary of State, saying openly, "We will not allow Jeremy Corbyn to be Prime Minister of the UK. It's unacceptable. It's unacceptable that should happen." As far as the US is concerned, as comrades said, the US actually runs the whole system. So I mean that's and you can see the interventions against Corbyn were in many ways by the ruling class itself. It actually beginning to expose itself because obviously it's the erosion of its social base, which continues. I mean, you can, as I say, you can see this, and fundamentally also, of course, is now what we're seeing, of course, not just here, but really particularly in the US, is the role of the union bureaucracy and the deliberate use of that layer, quite separated from the working class. I mean, if you look at the one, obviously the amount of money the bureaucrats get paid is a multiple of workers. Two, actually, people now don't actually work, have never worked in many cases in the industries they are supposed to represent. They are recruited directly and form a separate social layer. So what we're seeing, and we again, we're revisiting the limit. I mean, the point being is they're taking this excuse to cancel the strikes because they're desperate to get out of this situation. They desperately want to stop this movement. That's what the impact that is. And you can see the fundamental is the point actually which happened on Thursday when a series of walkouts in the North Sea, in the UK sector of the North Sea, which were condemned by all the unions. The workers walked off because they said, well, our wages have been eroded for 15 years. All of the unions, the RMT, Unite, and the GNMB, all denounced the action, and the thing was conducted as an official action. So we are getting to that point, and I think that all of this stuff comes together. Thanks.
Thank you, Matthew. Jerry, please.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to point out first that the first action of King Charles III was actually to have an audience with Liz Truss. This was his first action. Of course, nobody knows what it is they spoke about and what was on the agenda. But surely the question of the number of proposed bills, parliamentary bills against the trade unions, the proposal to make striking practically illegal, etc. These have great overtones of a police state. So the issue then is that the pending laws were surely a part of that discussion with King Charles. I would also mention that it's not just a question of the individual monarch or the individual the powers of the individual. Behind the individual in these circumstances, of course, is the Privy Council. The Privy Council is a very dangerous body that can abrogate to itself great powers, of course, with the monarch as the figurehead, really. And who is on the Privy Council? On the Privy Council, of course, there is traditionally always the Labour leaders and a section of the trade union bureaucracy. Now, I know it's been mentioned by a number of people before me, but I was particularly taken by the Roger Silverman and Ed and Matthew. This is by the trade union bureaucracy and the Labour leaders an unconditional surrender of the class struggle. This is an unconditional surrender. Of course, everybody hopes that the class struggle will revive once this period of mourning is over and that the strikes will resume. But a powerful signal has been given, and the powerful signal that has been given due to this collapse by the RMT, the TUC, and all that, the powerful signal that has been given is that capitalism itself will not be challenged. It will not, there won't be any kind of a revolutionary upsurge here. If we can do anything about it, we may get a few little minor reforms, but nothing more than that. And that's what we see. In England, we have practically no English Republicans in any office in the Labour movement. You can practically find none at all. Mick Lynch's abject collapse is one of the things. But back in the 19th century, we had the Red Republicans and the Chartists, and even Keir Hardie was a very militant pacifist. A very militant. He was still a pacifist, but he was a very militant pacifist. And the last thing I want to say really is people have been talking about grassroots democracy. People have been talking about, but how do we get our grassroots democracy? We get our grassroots democracy basically when workers in struggle form workers' defence guards to defend their picket lines and to defend their, and when these workers' defence guards then become community organisations and draw in the whole community, and there you have the beginning of real workers' democracy then, as opposed to the bogus bourgeois democracy. No matter how much bourgeois democracy you get through Parliament, you will never get socialism that way. It has to come from below, and it has to come from workers' democracy. And of course, as I have done several times in the past, you counterpose what was known as Soviet democracy in the days of the Russian Revolution to the bourgeois democracy of the Constituent Assembly, and we know which one made the revolution and which one opposed it. Thank you.
Thanks, Jerry. Anthony's our last speaker from the floor, and then we're going to bring the speakers back in to reply to some of these questions.
I think Jerry's underestimating the radicalisation. I was talking to one of my cousins yesterday, She's got mixed race children. A few years ago, in 2003, she blamed the government and not the refugees, but went very xenophobic during the London bombings. But now her partner, who's from the Caribbean, is supporting Barbados being a republic, supporting the protests in Brixton, and moving towards revolutionary politics and Marxism, the most radical I've ever seen. And the Queen doesn't do much for us, and things like that. I've never seen it like that. That's an indication. And millions are working and middle class people. I'm not surprised the barristers have stayed out, because the most advanced middle class people are going communist. But I think the fight for republic is essential. I think the mistake, I think you mentioned to it, Roger, you're breaking from Trotsky's uneven and combined development, about a few developments from the past and link up with capitalist elements. The only combined development, I think, I think the mistake you're making, Roger, is the crisis of the militant tradition. It's no accident militant broke up Socialist and Socialist alternative. They've got very similar politics. That they don't understand the bourgeois democratic task. I mean, Trotsky said the Russian Revolution began as a bourgeois democratic task to get rid of the monarchy, and then but to consolidate the monarchy, you had to go further towards a workers' state. And because you don't understand the dual nature of the national bourgeoisie against imperialism. If third imperialism is fine of the working class, but it's not going into bad imperialism, and you have a united front, but you fight for a proletarian leadership. The sectarian, particularly to the oppressed. SP changed to some extent, but socialism was very workerish and was on the black and the oppressed. And these are some of the mistakes you're making. And it's all tied up with militants degeneration. But I have one major mistake with Mike. I mean, my dad debated you 30 years ago when you were an ultra-left. I've known you since you've been 14, a year after that, and when you were adapted to Stalinism. But we've got to fight for, we've got to have a transition approach and make all kinds of alliances with it, but we've got to fight for a workers' republic. I think the ruling class battles are going to deepen after the funeral. For all the reasons Roger talked about, Scotland and Ireland, and also over the EU. They're closing ranks now because the final affairs of conservatives goes off like my cousin. They could be overthrown, but we can't move prematurely like the June days. We've got to get mass support. But I think we should start a referendum campaign after the funeral for a republic. But I'll leave that because of other things. But it was quite succinct tonight. Got to the hub of this.
Yes, thanks, Anthony. Okay, comrades, I suggest then we do it the other way, well, not the same way as we did earlier, that I start with Roger, then Mike, and then Kevin at the end.
Oh, fuck. Hang on, what's going on?
Ooh. Sorry?
Sorry, am I on speaker?
Is that Neil?
It is, yeah.
Hi, yes, I've asked you to switch on your camera, but you don't seem to be able to do it. Do you want to ask your question then without being seen?
Tried to do it loads of times and all it keeps it said you're inviting in and I've been pressing it all the time. Is it all right for me to speak for 2 minutes?
Okay, go on, yes.
Right, sorry. But okay, I can't believe tonight it's been the best meeting ever. I know I don't often get into it, but not Tony Greenstein, he was brilliant. He didn't get into complications. He got very straight tonight. It was excellent. But when I was first listening with Roger, I heard him starting, I thought he was going to almost make an excuse for the Queen, but he didn't. He did the right thing. And I agreed with that. What we need to recognise with people in this country is that the marriage of I started writing notes after about 3/4 now because I thought I wasn't going to say anything. I'll do this in 2.5 minutes. Is that okay? The marriage of the monarchy, right, to the state is a problem. Leading up to the 2019 general election, Boris Johnson was asked on TV, is the Queen, or what is the royal family, beyond reproach? And he replied, yes. Are you hearing me?
Yeah.
Are you hearing me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Sorry, it all went dead there. Clearly, Jeremy Corbyn was asked the same question, and he replied, no. And people are embedded in their own psyche with this virtue signalling stuff that's been going on now because of the death of the Queen, etc., etc. And someone else mentioned obsequious. Well, I say servile, obsequious, and sycophants. It's been thrown at us for the last, I've been studying this for the last 6-7 years, that it's been thrown at us so heavily since Jeremy became a leader. It's distraction. Don't look here, look there, look over there, don't take notes. And they're feeding people with constant garbage programs on television. And it's every single day or every single week. Are you still there? Because my phone keeps going blank. Can you hear me? Have I gone?
No, we can hear you still, but could you wind up now, please? Because we have to finish by 8.
Okay. What you've got is you've got like public every day MSM by the likes of Jeremy Vine, Nagamon Shetty, and Mike Shitey, as I call her. And Truss is now a massive danger to us. Obviously, we know what she's going to be doing. You know her plans. The public is misled by garbage TV, vacuous shows, distractions, attitudes, ruling classes, and of the masses. Now, going back to what Roger said in the first place, I actually thought, what's you got? And I clicked straight away what he was going to say with about 10 seconds. I thought he was going to try and say something nice about the Queen. That's not like Roger. But no, suddenly I got it and I said Philip before he did. If we'd had Philip in charge or something, that would have been straight into, a potential fascist state or something. But the problem is we've got here, you managed to hide your incandescence, Tina, and it was quite warming that you hid your incandescence at what the unions have done. Why do we have to keep kowtowing to this disgusting, vile, sickening establishment? I was watching television on the Thursday night and all these things went across and then you couldn't get anything else everywhere.
Comrades, could you wind up now, please? Make a last point, please.
Okay, all right, we've got John McDonnell, Burnsworth, blah, blah, blah. All I can say is everyone should read the Chris Williamson book. That's all I can say to most people. We can't be open to the derogatory and people on the left, people like John McDonnell. I've met all these people before and they're doing the right thing, but they can't placate the establishment anymore. We've got to stand up. The fact that the unions have done this, I find absolutely horrendous. They can't be scared of being disparaged by the masses or the mainstream media by saying, oh, well, okay, we'll pay some homage to the Queen. I understand what Roger said about the Queen was much less dangerous than who we could have had in place. But we need to get rid of all this bollocks. Anyway, I'm sorry to say, I have so much despair that.
Okay, thank you, Neil.
If that's what you're going to give us, can I have 10 more seconds?
Okay, go on, but please make it quick.
Probably got into power that have utterly destroyed him. And that's all I can say. It's despair. We need to fight and we can't be obsequious anymore. We can't be servile anymore. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thank you, Neil. Okay, Roger.
Right, thank you. First of all, I agree with those comrades who said that it's been an absolutely brilliant discussion, a democratic discussion, and but also really went deep into the issue. So first of all, I want to reply to Carol. I congratulate her on her courage in actually proclaiming that she is putting forward a social democratic program, and that is what it is. I'm sorry, it is the idea of a social democratic republic is pie in the sky. This is the idea that we go by steps and by stages. We have a transition to socialism, and this will be a step. That was precisely the program and the alibi of a whole succession of Labour leaders. It was actually the inspiration for the name of the Fabian Society, Fabius being a Roman general who proceeded very gradually, step by step. And the Fabian socialists adopted that as an analogy to what they were doing. It was the boast of every Labour leader up until the new Labour era when Blair took over and said, we're abandoning clause 4, we're abandoning the pretense that we're even moving slowly and gradually towards socialism. But before that, it was the alibi of every right-wing Labour leader that we have to go gradually and perhaps nationalise one industry at a time and so on. It just doesn't make sense, because the issue is that in order to overthrow the monarchy, which, as Ed said, would be impossible to do without dismantling the entire structure of the British state, the only way that you could do that would be to mobilize the working class. Which class is going to push for this fantasy social democracy? Surely not the capitalist class. It'll have to be the working class. And the working class will ask, if we're going to go to all the, if we're going to take on the task of overthrowing this fiendish, monstrous capitalist state, what are we going to get? Where are we going to stop? Will just abolishing the monarchy, is that going to solve the problems of the slump, which is going to completely devastate the lives of the mass of the millions of the working class? How is a democratic republic going to tackle the question of the inflation, which is completely robbing us of the right to feed our families or to heat our homes? How is it going to avoid and overcome the problems of the war and of other wars which are coming? Or of how is it going to solve the problem of climate change, which is threatening the lives of our children and our grandchildren? They'll say we have to overthrow the entire rotten, stinking capitalist system, and not just the frills and the superficial baubles that adorn the states. And that's why I think it's just pie in the sky. It's utopian to talk about the idea, and it's also completely misses the point to say we need to overthrow the monarchy, but we have to go slowly and hold back on carrying through the social and the economic goals. Just one or two other points I want to make. Well, one point really. I agree that it was absolutely shameful betrayal by the leaders of the RNT and the CWU and the other unions to call off their strikes, at least to postpone their strikes. It was also an absolute abdication of responsibility by the TUC at a time like this to cancel their conference, and of course was done to protect themselves against demands from the left for a proper, coordinated, all-class action for leading to a general strike action against the capitalist class, against this government. But I have to say it's a stupid blunder, but it's not, and it is a betrayal, but it's not yet at any rate, it's not a defeat, because the issues remain. The issues that are driving the working class. It wasn't just an idea by Mick Lynch or Dave Ward that let's have a strike. It was because they were impelled by the needs, the driving needs, the catastrophe of society now. That's what impelled them to call these strikes, and that is not going away. So the struggle will revive. I may be wrong, and I hope I'm not wrong, but I would say that within a couple of weeks, the death of the Queen will be ancient history, and the struggle will continue. The class struggle cannot be diverted just by casual incidents like that. Anyway, thank you all, comrades, for an excellent and stimulating discussion.
Thank you, Roger. I agree with you on the quality of the discussion was very good. Just to defend Carol, she probably didn't mean a social democratic in today's sense, but a socialist and democratic, the pre-1914 German social democracy way, I presume. We also don't have really much time to go into the general strike or not.
Don't
but
tempt me to respond.
I'm not tempting you, but it does, calling for the general strike now does raise the question of power, who rules society, etc. Is the left ready to take on that charge? Are the unions even interested in that? Doubtful. But we don't have time to go into that much now. But okay, Mike, please. Thank you.
Okay, very short. My understanding of this at the end of the day is if we're going to take power, it's going to have to be the coordinated action of the working class in more than one country. Yeah, because although all the things that are particular about Britain, the reality is that we're more vulnerable, and we can see this actually with the all the things which have followed from Brexit, and with the disruptions from COVID and et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Britain is actually more vulnerable to economic sanctions than Russia is, for example. As comrade, I can't remember which comrade it is, at the end of the day, made the point, at the end of the day, the United Kingdom is a vassal state of the United States of America. Pompeo is able to say, we won't allow Corbyn to become prime minister. He didn't need to actually organize a military coup to prevent that. It was good enough to organize a press campaign, a new Zinoviev letter on a very large scale. But nonetheless, that's the basic structure. And then the question of how you're going to actually prevent that is going to require action on a European scale. And we had an opportunity when during British membership of the European Union to coordinate action on a European scale by exploiting in a disloyal way the institutions of the European Union. We wasted it because half of the left became loyal to the pro-capitalist, entrenched, far more seriously entrenched neoliberal constitution of the European, ordo-liberal constitution of the European Union, and the other half of the left thought the way out of that was to go for socialism in a single country. Okay, that's a slight diversion from our topic, which is the topic of the monarchy. My understanding of why this topic is the question of the monarchy is fundamental. It's one of the backstops. It's one of the institutional forms. It's part of the glue, constitutional glue, which holds together the loyalty of the armed forces acting on behalf of the capitalist class. But it's not the immediate means, it's backstop. The immediate means by which the capitalist class rules is the combination of bribes paid to politicians, bribes paid to journalists in the forms of the advertising funded media, and bribes paid, so it's very ambiguous, our question about the strike action by barristers. I can understand why barristers on the criminal side are doing it, but it's extremely ambiguous because at the end of the day, the free market in legal services is one of the institutional pillars of the direct rule of the capitalist class. And finally, the free movement of capital and the ability of capital to just run away, as it did in 1976, as it did in the Mitterrand regime in France, as it did for even the Hollande administration in France. And we have to propose common action of the working class on the European scale, but we also have to propose an alternative to decision-making through markets and money. And here Roger is right that it's no good to say we're just going to fiddle with the political decision-making mechanism, but in order to deal with, we need political democracy in order to have working class. The comrades have been talking about the trade union bureaucracy betraying us. The trade union bureaucracy betrays us because of the monarchist and rule of law form of the constitutional order of the trade unions and the Labour Party. We have to fight against the principle of one-man management just as much in the Labour Party and the trade unions as we do, and in the far left for that matter, as we do in the state. We have to fight against it in the state, partly actually in order to fight against it in the Labour Party and the trade unions and the workers' movement in general. We have to fight against this rule of law conception that the solution is going to be through some sort of judicial power independence, clever litigation tactics, or for that matter, the Euro-communist conception of clever media management tactics remove from us the need to build our own media. All of this stuff is implicated in the question of monarchism, and it's not because it's monarchism the monarchism in the state. The monarchism in the state is the backstop. The immediate outworks which are holding us under control is the monarchism, both in the sense of loyalism to the state, but also actually of the monarchist conception of organization, of decision making in the labour movement. I have one small point. A couple of comrades raised the question of, as an alternative to parliamentarism, direct democracy through electronic means, emails and stuff like that. And I'm sorry, I did actually think about this. We talked about it because Paul Cockshott raised this 10, 15 years ago. And hey, a lot of these decisions are decisions which have to be taken on a world scale. So I get up, we give the right of initiative. Everybody has the right to make a proposal. So I get up in the morning and I log on to my electronic and I find 20 million emails to be answered for me to take individual decisions on all these right of initiative referendum proposals. It doesn't work. We need the mechanism, some mechanisms of filtering out and filtering down between the 50 plus million people, allowing for the kids to be relatively less likely to make proposals, all having their own particular ideas. Somehow we have to actually work through that. And that means we need parties and we need representation, whether that representation is in the form of workers' councils or parliamentary, quasi-parliamentary bodies, or just giving back power to local government and so on and so forth. All of these things are possible, but the idea that universal referenda is the solution, no. Universal referenda produces things like the Scottish referendum, Scottish independence referendum, or the Brexit referendum, or vote for the crook, not the fascist in presidential elections, and so on. That's it.
Thank you, Mike. Good points at the end in particular. Kevin, please.
Okay, I'd like to agree with what comrades have said about the discussion. I think it's an important one to have, partly because I think it's not really going on elsewhere. So, to that extent, I think we've done a good job this evening, but let's hope it's just the beginnings of the discussion. Like other comrades, I want to try to separate both the institutional structures of the monarchy from the individuals. And I don't really want to talk too much about, the immediate situation. But I do think that what's been raised this evening have been some quite fundamental questions about what we mean both by socialism and by democracy. And these questions are very rarely, in fact, are never touched on by the leaders of the labour movement, even I would suggest the left in the movement. Because in our critique of the monarchy and in our demands for the idea of a republic, we're putting forward a very different conception of democracy and a very different conception of sovereignty and a very different conception of power. And what we're talking about is the creation of real democracy. We're talking about a process that leads to the raising of political consciousness, and above all, the idea, as Mike and other comrades have described it, self-government, that individual citizens, individual workers are quite capable of governing themselves, that organized groups of workers, organized groups of citizens in whatever way in the localities, and above all in the particular state as a whole, are quite capable of governing themselves. So the critique of monarchy is not just a critique of individuals. It's not, although that's very important, it's not just a critique of the reserve power of the state and the nature of state power. It's actually a critique of the idea of democracy and counterposing an alternative argument about the nature of democracy, something that is very rarely touched on. Often in the British labour movement, the focus is on economic struggles. The focus is on very important issues like fight against cuts, fight against austerity, fight for higher wages. but it is very rarely touches upon the idea of political empowerment, and in particular the self-emancipation of the working class. So the idea of the republic is to identify the nature of power in a bourgeois society, but also to take part in a battle for power in that bourgeois society, to mobilize the working class and to expose the nature of power, and to pose the idea of an alternative conception of power and of democracy. So Mike's idea of self-government and of political agency by the working class is, I think, really central. And that's really what's missing from the debate, and not this debate here, but what's missing from the discussion about the monarchy, any sense of an alternative. Because if, for example, we challenge the monarchy, we either get, well, we do get the primary argument, what do you put in its place? And somebody says a democratic republic like America, which is just another form of monarchical rule. And that monarchical rule permeates the whole of bourgeois society. So we're putting forward different conceptions, and those conceptions have to be an important part of our struggle. Just simply to focus on the economic, I think, doesn't challenge that power, and above all, doesn't build a sense of self-confidence and the potential of the working class. A lot of comrades ask, well, how are we going to do this? And I suppose we're talking about rearming the working class, rearming the workers' movement with those ideas. And by meetings like this, we're raising the idea that state power and the nature of the state, the nature of democracy, are just as important questions to our movement as the usual economic demands. When was the last time, for example, that any sort of leader on the left raised these questions? Right? When was this raised? It's a very long time, and then when it's done in a very shamefaced way. You will remember, this is just a conclusion outcomes. You'll recall that Jeremy Corbyn was one of the sponsors of the Commonwealth of Britain bill, which was an attempt to put a bill into the House of Commons in terms of abolition of the monarchy. It's very interesting that when he became the Labour leader, that was all put to one side, as comrades have said. Now that was not just, I think, personal cowardice. It wasn't just tactical considerations. It was, I think, part and parcel of the type of reformist politics at the top of our movement. And we have to fight for an alternative to that. We have to really, I suppose, go for fundamentals. And that is something that's really sadly lacking. But this debate on the monarchy opens that up. When we're talking about it with our workmates, when we're talking about it with our neighbours, we're not just talking about whether X or Y is suitable. We're not even talking about the expense of the institution. We're talking about how society should be run and whether we are capable as workers to run our society, to run our own lives, because that essentially is what the battle for power is about.
Absolutely. I think that was a really, really interesting discussion, and definitely not a boring issue like you sometimes get told by the left, or we have to wait for socialism, it's not for now, it's for socialism. When in fact, I think the call, the demand for republicanism, for democracy from top to bottom is very much part and parcel of the way to get to socialism. Unless we take those issues of how we're ruled seriously and fight for them and take them, as ours and have alternatives, we'll never get to the idea of socialism. We'll never get anywhere close unless we take that serious, discuss it. Just a final point in terms of, are we going to do what we did, to what our forebearers did to Charles I? I don't think anybody is proposing that we have to kill them all, or like some of the Bolsheviks, a local Bolshevik committee did to the Tsarist family. I don't think that's what anybody is proposing. But we would actually, by abolishing the monarchy, would actually be freeing some of these people who are now currently trapped in what must be one of the most horrific jobs you can have. Being part of the royal family sounds like hell on earth to me. So in that sense, I think we're doing them a big favor, and perhaps there might be even some closet Republicans amongst them, for example, Meghan and Harry, who knows? That'd be cool getting them on board. Okay, thank you, comrades, very much for joining us for this interesting discussion. Join us again on Thursday in our LLA education series, and we'll be looking at John McLean in our series Lives of the Left, introduced by Sandy McBurney. Have a good evening.